You are now listening to the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Welcome to the Radiance Films Podcast, a show dedicated to all things Radiance Films. I'm your host, Adam Lundy, and I am delighted to be joined once again by the Fanatical Dragon. Hey, Dragon.
Hello, hello. Welcome. Great to be back, man. Great to be back. I've still been listening, and the show's been going from strength to strength.
I appreciate it. Well, look, obviously there was a large gap, between episodes at some point, but you were on once upon a time. We talked. I was trying to remember what we talked about. We definitely talked about a world noir set. I don't remember what the other stuff was on that episode.
I don't remember either. I've got a terrible habit of only remembering the most recent thing I did, and I think we were on your other show talking about Zatoichi.
Of course,
that wasn't for Radiance. So I think it was probably World Noir. I want to say Volume 2.
It was definitely Volume 2. Yeah, it was definitely World Noir Volume 2.
Black Gravel and basically everything else is on that set, and presumably some of the other stuff that came out that same month. But I can't think. It's like my brain is a horrible mess of porridge, oats, and mince at the best of times, and so it was. I can't remember. But I remember having fun.
I appreciate that. I'm wondering if we even took advantage of your noted skill set of East Asian cinema, because I don't actually know if we did talk about that. Obviously, I could just easily check this episode in the list and know for sure. But if we didn't happen to touch on East Asian cinema, which is your speciality, I would say.
Speciality is maybe a stretch. I would say it's the thing that I'm most into, and I've probably been watching the longest. But I would be loath to call myself an expert, but just a very dedicated and enthusiastic fan of East Asian cinema is maybe a better way of saying it, and consume as much as I can.
Well, we'll definitely be taking advantage of that on this episode anyway. So as the title suggests, dear listeners, we're going to be talking through the March releases, which of course contains a very specific box set that we'll run through. Before we get into the nitty gritty, I am recording, we are recording this episode on Friday the 10th. So that means the latest announcements came out a little bit delayed. I can probably guess one reason why they were delayed. I can just guess, be purely hypothetical. But we got some transmission announcements on Wednesday, and then the Radiance slate came through today. To just kind of briefly look at the transmission titles that were announced the other day. The first one is probably the one that most people would have had their eye caught by. It's the Nicolas Cage vehicle, Vampire's Kiss. Which is coming for apparently a world premiere 4K UHD release. I've never seen Killer's Kiss. I've had it recommended to me over the years, but I've never gotten around to it.
I have, but not for a long time. And it came around a spate of Nicolas Cage movies that I saw in pretty close proximity. But that one I remember as being pretty memorable for his performance, which is saying something for that era of Nick Cage, because he didn't do anything small at that point. But I remember him doing his best kind of Bela Lugosi's and everything else thrown in there. And yeah, it's good fun. It kind of has a feel of like a vampire version of After Hours. That's
okay. I'm so glad you said that, because when I was looking at like some of the images and reading the plot, I was thinking to myself, it did have that After Hours vibe to it. So I'm so glad that you said that. I feel very vindicated.
100%. And those, I sometimes find After Hours quite a frustrating watch, because you get so invested in his attempt to just get home that I find that the longer that it takes for him to get home in After Hours, the more that I start to resent the film for dragging me along on this journey with him, which I think is what its intended purpose is. Right? That's the emotion he's trying to elicit. And Vampire's Kiss has some of that same energy, but without the frustration. I found it like really enjoyable, partly because of how crazy he is in it. To kind of see this journey that he's going on. But yeah, I think everyone's going to enjoy that one. It's going to do well.
Yeah, that'll be one I'll definitely pick up, as I've kind of mentioned in the first few episodes of the year since the kind of transmission stuff has come out. I'm not going to be picking up every transmission release. I'm going to be a bit more picky choosy with that. With those, I'm
Hmm.
going to be grabbing them as I like them. I've gotten them all so far, but I'm probably going to skip the next month's one, for example. But Vampires, that'll be one I'll be jumping on for sure.
Mm.
Any of the ones that come kind of with the big chunky box, I just kind of have to get them. They just a big chunky box just looks so good on a shelf. It's hard to say
Hmm.
no. And then especially when it's a film that was already on my watch list anyway, it seems a bit silly to not dive in. The other transmission title that was announced, I know very little about. I'm somewhat intrigued by them, but I'm gonna have to do a bit more research before I know for sure if it's going to be a pickup for me. So
Yeah. That's the
it's
two boxes set, right? Two boxes
yeah,
televised terror in Franco's Spain.
yeah, exactly. So it's two films. One's called La Cabina and the other is called El Televisor. Um, I don't know too much about them. Again, I'd never heard of the filmmakers. So the first one's made by Antonio Mercero, and the other one is Narcisco Ibáñez Serrandor. I've never heard of these guys. From what I can tell, these were basically TV movies
Hmm.
um, that were sort of kind of invoking that kind of post Franco um societal changes and stuff like that through film. So it sounds interesting in itself, but yeah, I'd never heard of them before, so I need to do a bit more research to know if I'm going to pick them up or not. Like reading what Radiance have put on or put out about them. Apparently, La Cabina apparently got like a huge cult following in the UK and stuff because it was like shown late at night regularly.
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't know if you'd know much about that, if you'd ever heard of that
Not
before.
not really, other than it sounded like I wondered if in some ways it had been the inspiration for the Colin Farrell movie Phone Booth, because that's like the plot synopsis sounds not a million miles away.
Hmm.
So I think kind of a guy basically stuck on a phone call, and that's kind of you're staying with him for the duration of the movie and that call, and presumably the things that are happening around it. So I'm intrigued by the setup, but I don't know very much about it either, actually, or that era um, of um, of kind of movies that were coming out of Spain in that period.
Yeah,
Um,
Spain is kind of a blind spot for me, generally speaking, weirdly enough. Spanish cinema is kind of a little bit underrepresented by a lot of like the boutique labels.
a,
Um,
a little bit. I mean, back in the day, Tartan used to do bits and pieces, and there was a kind of few real breakout hits in the kind of horror side of things. There was Thesis or Thesis,
oh
which I
yeah,
think was probably the tail end of the 90s. I remember seeing that, and the guy who I think Arrow maybe put out a box set of, the guy who directed Action Mutante, but I think his stuff is all late 90s as well. Um, Alex de la Iglesia, and he kind of seemed to have again his toe sort of one foot in horror, the other foot in kind of comedy, and he did these sort of weird blends of the two. But that's all way later. And then the Wreck movies
oh of
um,
course, yeah, the rec
out of
movies.
Spain. But again, that's all way later. I mean, I think that's
Yeah,
early 2000s.
yeah,
So that
like
era is again blind
I
spot for me too.
I think the only kind of what we would call a kind of a classic era, so like talking like 40s, 50s, 60s film from Spain that I've seen is the one that Radiance put out last year. Was it Los Golfos? I think
Hmm.
that's like the only kind of, again, what we'd kind of call a classic era film from Spain that I've seen. That's without me Googling it now. I don't remember when Spirit of the Beehive came out. I think that's the 70s or maybe the 80s.
I think
Um,
70s, but I could be wrong.
so that would have been like the only other one I've seen, I think. So again, maybe that's an area rife for rediscovery, but I don't know much about the actual business at that stage. Like, was there many films being produced that weren't propaganda and stuff?
Mhm.
Nationalist, kind of films, pro Franco stuff. So something to maybe do some research on, I guess. If especially if I'm gonna cover these in a future episode. We'll need to
Mhm.
dive in there. Um, and then on to today's announcements then, which is obviously all Radiant stuff. So I'll keep the kind of big one to last. So the three kind of standard releases that we have. The first one is by Shuji Terayama, and that's the Boxer. Now I'm familiar
Mhm.
with Terayama. I haven't seen any of his films, but I'm familiar with him mainly because of that film where it's like throw away your books, rally in the streets. Is that the right? Do I have the
Hmm.
title right? I haven't
Hmm.
seen it, but I've heard about it a lot over the years. And I know that Teriyama was someone that was being touted as being the subject of the next Radical Japan box set, which now seems unlikely. Um, have you seen this film by any chance? Or are you
I
familiar
haven't
with
seen
it?
this, not this particular film, but I'm very familiar with its kind of star and I think
Mm,
motivation for being making, because I think that this was a project that was kind of largely orchestrated and gotten off the ground by its main star Bunta Sugagara,
mm.
who's phenomenal, and I think he's been on a I think he's been on a couple of Radiant releases so far, but we hasn't had
Yes.
a huge focus to the degree that his career at some point definitely warrants, because he was insanely prolific and a really interesting kind of really strong presence on screen. He kind of generally often played a lot of gangsters, a lot of Yakuza members, a lot of kind of very much fervent anti-hero characters, but was incredible. And the fact that he's in this, I haven't seen this particular movie, but I'll pick it up just purely by the fact of being a huge fan of him, and really intrigued to kind of see. Also, because I kind of have a bit of a soft spot for boxing movies, so I'm intrigued to kind of see those two worlds collide. I'd like to kind of see what they've done. It looks good. That's the one I was
Yeah,
most excited about.
yeah, like but Bundesliga, he's actually been in quite a few Radiance releases.
Hmm.
Most recently, he was in the Japanese Godfather trilogy, which I don't know if you've
Yeah,
gotten around to watching.
I've got the
Um,
set. I haven't had a chance to dive through it so far.
they're
Um,
fantastic. They
mm.
act they far exceeded my expectations.
I
Um,
have high hopes because I love the director's other movie they put out before, the Rapacious
Yes,
Jailbreaker was
Rapacious
great.
Jailbreaker, brilliant film as well. That another one exceeded my expectations. So, but he's in all three. This isn't really a spoiler. It's just kind of funny. He plays three different characters in the films, so it's kind of confusing
Hmm.
because he'll just show up and I'll be like, oh, that's the character from the last film, and it'll just be someone completely different. So
Hmm.
he's in all three, but he plays different characters in all three. He's in By a Man's Face, Shall You Know Him?
Hmm. The
The
Taiketo movie,
Taikedo
which is
film.
incredible. Yeah, yeah.
And then he was also in Japan Organized Crime Boss and The Shape of the Night. So he's actually been
Hmm.
pretty well represented by Radiance so far, which is cool. I know that he was mainly in the Battles Without Honor and Humanity, which obviously Arrow put out, but I assume Fran was probably heavily involved with
Oh yeah, definitely,
that
definitely.
at that stage. So um yeah, so obviously, look, he's well represented, and it's good that he's getting because I had never heard of him before I started watching Radiance films.
Ah, okay.
So it's cool that I'm getting exposed to him because I really like him as well. I'm looking forward to seeing this for him because I think he's a really great actor.
Yeah.
He's I think he's fairly underrated in terms of like when you think of like big Japanese actors from this era, most people who would be in the know maybe wouldn't be the first name that comes to mind.
No, I think he was more often than not. I think either because he was one part of a larger ensemble in
Yeah.
most of the movies he was in, or he was kind of a very solid supporting actor rather than necessarily always being a leading man. He did have a few where he's leading the charge on. I think The Boxer's definitely one of those. But a lot of the times he was just there to kind of serve the story, even if it was quite a small part.
Hmm.
And acted up until pretty late. I think he still kept on going until about 2008, 2010 sort of time, I think.
Nice. Okay.
And he passed in 2014. So I mean, he kept on working pretty much until almost until the end,
Right.
which
Okay.
seems very, very common in Japan. I think we saw the same with Tetsuya Nakadai as well. He was acting right up until just a year or two before he passed.
Mm.
They just never retire. They just kind of
Yeah,
keep on going.
it's just part of their life, I guess.
Yeah.
Just kept it up. But I'm really looking forward to this film as well. And I will say the artwork is really really cool as well. I love the
Hmm.
artwork that's been commissioned for this. It's really really stunning. Um, the next film is one I'd never heard of the filmmaker. But, I know the star because I've seen a few films that he's in, and I always enjoy his work. So this is The Double, which
Hmm.
was directed by a guy called Romello Guerrieri.
Hmm.
If I have that right. It's labeled as a kind of what's the phrase that they used, which I really liked, a metaphysical giallo. Um,
Mm.
I love that terminology. So this stars Jean Sorel, who's an interesting dude. He's very much in a lot of genre films. The film that I saw him in most recently was when, at the start of the year, I was trying to fill in the gaps of the Radiant stuff that came in last year that I hadn't watched when it had arrived.
Okay.
I just kind of put it aside. And he's in the film that came out last year that ended up being my favorite film from last year that I did not expect to like at all, and that was Rosa La Rose. He plays
Okay.
a pimp in that.
Hmm.
And he's brilliant in that film, and that film is just brilliant in general. I didn't expect to like it at all. I purposely put it off, watching it because I was like, I'm not going
Hmm.
to enjoy this. This doesn't seem like it's my style, and it ended up being my favorite film of last year, because it's phenomenal. So I like this guy. He was in another giallo that I saw a couple of years ago that I'm struggling to remember the name of. It was basically like a riff on Vertigo,
Okay.
where he plays like the kind of male lead in that as well. But this one sounds really interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with the filmmaker. I'm certainly not.
No, no, this is another Radiance doing what Radiance do, and bringing us things that you kind of almost start doubting yourself a little bit, where you're like, okay, this seems like something I definitely should have heard of. Why have I not heard of? And then the more that you dive into it, quite often they just end up being these incredible gems. But I think that that's become Radiance's big main unique selling point, the big
Yeah,
USP. Whether that's kind of what they do. They seem to kind of have this unbelievable reach to kind of go back into the archives of film history and pull out some real gems. I suspect this might well be another one of those instances because it sounds amazing on paper.
yeah, and this is it's marked as a world Blu-ray premiere, so that I guess that makes sense that it's somewhat undiscovered.
Hmm.
If it, I'm sure someone put out a DVD somewhere back in the day, but this is apparently a world Blu-ray premiere. And I suppose the one marker for me as to whether I should or shouldn't know a filmmaker is, when they're like put it in the description, they have the filmmaker's name or an actor or whoever, and they always
Hmm.
put in parentheses like their most well-known work or something that you
Hmm.
should like really know. And even
Yeah.
like the film for this guy, which is The Sweet Body of Deborah, never heard of it.
Hmm.
So I guess it's a
Same.
marker that I'm I'm okay that I don't know this guy if I don't even know whatever they've put in the parentheses.
The other
Uh,
thing I'm starting to notice is they're because they've got these world noir sets up and running, where and I guess this is probably slightly outside of the generic conventions of noir, but the fact of when movies end up going standalone rather than going into a box set always kind of makes me pay a little bit more attention as well. Where I
hmm.
think it kind of gives you an indication of how Radiance themselves feel about the title, where they're pretty confident that everyone's going to love it, maybe more so than some of the ones that they decide to bundle.
I see.
So I
Okay.
don't know if that's just my own ridiculous theory, but I always kind of pay a little bit more attention to the standalone individual part releases when they come around, particularly kind of when it's world cinema stuff. So yeah,
Hmm.
intriguing.
No, that's an interesting point of view on it. I never really considered that. Um, I guess that would make you wonder why they wouldn't just do an Imamura box set, because like Imamura is
Hmm.
just going to sell on his name alone.
Yeah,
Um, but no, it's
I
a
wonder if that
theory.
if that that might well have been a conversation that was had because I think they've got a couple of his titles coming out, and kind of maybe they yeah, I don't know who we can only speculate, but yeah, I
Yeah,
think kind of that could have been interesting as another standalone, or another separate little kind of compilation set.
another set. Maybe I suppose they don't want to do too much because obviously there's going to be Radical Japan at some point. We just don't know what the filmmaker is going to be. Maybe they just don't want to do two kind of Japanese centric box sets in a year or something like that. It could have been something as simple as that, really. But yeah.
Maybe, although Adam, just say that very last line again. You just start to break up a little bit.
So the with 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 a Radical Japan set coming out, we just don't know um the subject of it. It could just be a case where they don't want to put out two kind of Japan centric box sets in a year. Um,
Yeah, quite
so
possibly.
could be something along those lines. But we are just speculating at the end of the day. Um, the last of the kind of standard releases, I say standard release, this is a 4K and Blu-ray, but it's still kind of a standard standalone release.
Hmm.
Is the Wojciech Haas film, The Hourglass Sanatorium.
Hmm.
The trend of this is that I've heard of Wojciech Haas, but I've never seen any of his films. I know his most kind of well-known one is the Saragossa manuscript.
Hmm.
I've heard of it, never seen it. I don't recall ever hearing of this film before.
Same.
Um, but it sounds super interesting. It sounds kind of similar to a film that Radiance put out last year called Malpertuis or Malpertui. Well, I can never remember how to pronounce it.
Hmm.
Um, the one by the same guy who did Daughters of Darkness, whose name has left my brain. It sounds somewhat similar to that in plot, where this guy shows up at a kind of crumbling big building and ends up going on a metaphysical journey throughout that building. Um, so it sounds interesting on paper. This one was one that a lot of people had kind of like on the Radiant subreddit, I should say, had kind of clocked as, yeah, this is probably going to be this film. So it seems like this has a fan base or it has some kind of a cult following if people were like able to pinpoint from last month's clue that this was going to be the film and kind of pieced it together. So it seems like it has some kind of a cult following. In fact, actually, I think that this film, I'm actually never double checked this, but from the comments that I saw, I think Vinegar Syndrome might have released this film recently, but just on Blu-ray. I'm just going to fact check that
Yeah.
um, really quick because I forgot to do it earlier when I was supposed to. The
While
hour.
you're checking that, I should say I'm kind of in the same boat. I remember hearing the director's name quite a bit, and I think we were shown a couple of extracts from some of his work, probably from the Saragossa manuscript, when I was at film school. But I don't
Okay.
remember really diving into that much of his stuff. But I think the bits and pieces that I did see were always really kind of visually pretty arresting. Like there was a lot of there was a lot more going on cinematography wise, production, set design, those sorts of things. And this and the Hourglass Sanatorium looks definitely like it's going to be a feast for the senses in that regard. It kind of looks like it's been shot pretty incredibly, and the stills that I've seen of it all look really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, the
Um,
stills I saw all look phenomenal. So
yeah.
it definitely looks like it's going to be dripping in atmosphere.
Hmm.
It was released on Blu-ray by a Vinegar Syndrome partner label called Yellow Veil Pictures.
Ah, okay.
But does like it was just put out on Blu-ray because I'm pretty sure I saw a comment saying, "Oh, of course I just picked up the Blu-ray. Now I'm gonna have to double dip to get the 4K." Those kind of comments. So
That's always the
it's,
way. It's like
yeah,
it's the buses at the bus stop rule. You kind of you wait ages for one, and then a cluster show up together.
someone has to be
Often
the
just because
sacrificial lamb.
yeah, a wee bit, yeah, but often just because it's I mean the assets are now more available, and there's sometimes going to be new restorations done and stuff, and um, the the contract negotiations for UK versus America must be a hellish nightmare to try and navigate for everybody involved. So I think in some ways it's nice for people who don't want to import or people who haven't kind of got multi-vision machines have an
Yeah, for
opportunity to
sure.
kind of get this domestically, and also for the Americans to potentially be able to upgrade to a 4K because
Yeah,
the
well,
4Ks won't be region coded.
correct. Yeah, exactly. 4K won't be region coded, so I'm sure that this will likely, be sold by the likes of Diabolique and those other kind of retailers over in the US that kind of specialize in importing stuff over from region B. So I'm sure they'll be able to get their hands on it relatively easily if they so wished.
Yeah, and
Um,
beautiful cover art again. I mean, Time Tomorrow just, I'm
Absolutely.
kind of really, really, really glad that Radiance has kind of taken the commitment of just going with one singular designer. It's a really bold thing to do in today's day and age where everybody's kind of scrabbling over themselves to get different cover artists, and that can kind of make a collection kind of be quite irregular on the shelves. When you jump between so many different designers, you would always hope that they keep certain things consistent, but nobody else really, no other label actually, I think has kind of gone in with such a singular vision and supported one singular. I think there's a few people in Time Tomorrow. I think it's a bit of a collective, but one kind of consistent design choice, and it's working so well for them. And this is a beautiful, beautiful example of Time Tomorrow's work on the Hourglass Sanatorium.
Okay,
Just a
actually,
glorious cover.
I'm glad you brought this up because I was a little bit curious because maybe I'm looking in the wrong places, but I sometimes do get curious about the artwork and who does them. So
Mhm.
this is something that this is news to me, so it might be news to listeners as well. So from what you're saying, Radiance only hire one collective to do all their artwork. Is that correct? As
I
opposed
believe
to
so. Yeah.
commissioning.
And I mean, I
Interesting.
think for the most part, almost all the stuff, unless in I can only imagine in very extreme instances where there is a lack of assets, but it's almost exclusively working from some form of photographic starting point. So they're generally always using photographic elements from the original film and then doing a little bit of work to, I think probably in most cases, to minimalize or stylize that image slightly more. So they're probably taking out more than they're putting in. Certainly in the likes of the Shinobi no Mono box sets, they're all using elements that were in the original Japanese posters, but with all of the kind of noise, for want of a better word. And I'm not meaning that in a disparaging way, because I love the original posters for those movies, but they're removing an awful lot of the Japanese text, and they're removing a lot of the other elements that would normally be there in a sort of collage in the original poster, and just stripping it back to its core element of usually the main star. Same thing for the Bounty Hunter trilogy, and they've done exactly the same thing for World Noir, and even the Dai Gothic sets, which look almost, if you're giving them a quick glance, it looks almost like it's an illustration.
Oh,
but
for sure.
They're still coming from a photographic element with maybe kind of just a little bit of Photoshop filtering put over the top to kind of enhance the colors. But to my knowledge, I think Time Tomorrow have worked on every single one, and I don't think they've ever stepped away. I don't know if that's true for the transmission releases, but it's certainly true for the Radiance titles. And there's a great interview, if everyone got sent the really nice sort of 2025 book that kind of came out towards the tail end of the year from our orders, if you'd ordered direct from Radiance. And there was a kind of really nice mix of kind of information updates and a little bit of speculation about what 2026 would bring, and also an interview with the principal designer at Time Tomorrow, who's been working on the vast majority of most of the Radiance releases, and his perspective is really, really interesting to read, and kind of speaks a little bit about the process and his kind of, I guess, his ethos or his feelings towards poster design in general, and kind of poster design for movies in particular. So it's a really great little read that I'd heartily recommend everyone. If you've got sent that book, then dive in and have a check out of that.
That's super interesting. Yeah, it was a pity that that book was kind of just, it was somewhat limited. If you were a subscriber, then you got it. If you were someone like me who just buys stuff every month, or just picks up, if you're just someone who just picks stuff up every now and again, it was a lottery. It wasn't sent out to everyone who made an order, which is a bit of a pity, but obviously I know that it was a limited run. You know, not everybody can get one. I think, if I remember correctly, somebody back in January time posted it all on the Radiance subreddit. So you need to do a bit of scrolling or a bit of searching, but I'm pretty sure you could find everything that was included in that on the Radiance subreddit if you were that inclined to want to check that out. That's really cool context for the artwork. I said I was not aware that it was a cohesive agreement with every release, as opposed to, you know, different artists coming and going, you know, on a kind of commission basis. So that's very interesting. So I appreciate you bringing that information. Certainly will not be the last bit of information that you bring on this episode. Before we get into the March stuff, then just the last thing, obviously, is the big kind of announcement. Something that's been teased for like 18 months at this stage. It was originally part of the 2025 kind of hint slate. And then, for reasons that I assume are to do with rights and agreements with rights holders, etc., it got pushed back to this year. And I assume up until this week, it was still probably touch and go, which is why everything was delayed till today. This is just me speculating, but if I had to guess why the Radiant stuff was delayed to today, I would put my mortgage on it being something to do with this set. So this is Histoire du Cinéma and Other Works by Jean-Luc Godard. This is always a very scary question to ask another human being, but general thoughts on Godard?
Yeah, not the biggest fan overall. I'm always interested by him, but I think between not that it is a French war, but I think I was always slightly more of a Truffaut guy. Again, a lot of the stuff was kind of force fed to us at an age when I was probably a little bit too young to appreciate it when I was at film school, and there's kind of always that slight resentment of the stuff that you're obligated to watch rather than the stuff that you choose to watch. And so sadly for me, that a lot of the Jean-Luc Godard work that I have seen kind of falls into that. I don't doubt that at some point I'll probably come back to it at a different period in my life and feel a bit differently. But I think kind of I have a huge amount of respect for him, and more so than I do an enthusiasm for his work. But there's a couple that I've seen that I've enjoyed, like kind of Breathless and Contempt. Basically the ones that were put out previously back in the day by Criterion,
Hmm.
are the ones that I'd kind of I think I'm probably most familiar with because of probably because of Criterion, because of kind of like coming to them because they were films that they'd kind of like really zeroed in on. But yeah, that's I don't want to I don't
So
want to ruffle any feathers.
a
But
very
yeah, he's
diplomatic answer. A very diplomatic answer. And to be fair, I think the vast majority, even the majority of people who like Godard will probably say, I really like Godard's work up until, X year. And then
hmm
that's when he lost me. And I kind of fall into that camp as well. What you said is interesting about what you were kind of forced to watch in film school, and that, having an impact on the enjoyment. I was the opposite because I discovered Godard on my own. He was one of the
okay.
first kind of art house filmmakers that I watched when I was just kind of discovering stuff when I was like 16, 17.
hmm
And I remember watching Breathless and it blew me away and I just got really into him. So I've always liked him. A lot of his stuff does frustrate me, especially his later stuff. Like, I have a pretty hard cutoff point at Poirot Le Fou, and then everything after Poirot Le Fou that I've watched, I've somewhat struggled with, or as a best case scenario, I've somewhat struggled with it. As a worst case scenario, it was impenetrable bullshit.
Mm.
So I really like his early stuff. Some like for like Viva Savie, for example, like that's one of my favorite films of all time. I think that Anna Karina's performance in Viva Savie is one of the best performances in film history. So I'm really
hmm
into the early stuff, and then as time goes on, as he kind of pushed against narrative filmmaking and even just like filmmaking in general, the further he pushed against that, the more he lost me a little bit. Now,
hmm
I have seen Histoire du Cinema. I don't know if you have you is this something that's come across your table at
No,
some point?
I
So
don't think so.
I watched it a few years ago when I was trying to fill in as much of the Sight and Sound poll results. So I was
Okay.
I was I was basically just watching through the stuff that I hadn't just kind of seen just by just watching stuff. Um, and the only way I could find it was on like some Internet Archive style website where everything was in absolute dog shit quality. Like we're talking like 360 or maybe 480p at best.
hmm
Um, really bad quality. Um, it's super long, but it's split into episodes. Um,
Okay.
but to call it a film would probably be a stretch because it's not really a film. It's more of like a meta-textual anti-film, but also about the history of film, but about sounds and colors and everything. It's kind of like it's history of the world told through film, told through sounds, and told through colors. It's it's something that like if you hate Godard, you'll probably hate this, and you'll point to this to kind of say, this is my proof that Goddard's a load of bullshit. This is the proof. I have it here. This is the hard evidence that Goddard's a pretentious nutcase. Um, but if you just kind of like just like wash over you, then I think there's a lot to get out of it. Like it is like it's impenetrable because there is no narrative and there's not even a sense of a narrative.
Mhm.
For me, it was almost like watching a modern art piece. It was much more closer to that. So I
Okay.
personally actually found it very meditative,
Okay.
just to
I mean,
kind of
how experimental is it? Are we talking like
like
Stan Brakhage levels
like
of
we're
the?
we're we're talking like this is like I can't even describe. So there will literally be it's like a collage of images with also Godard talking in pure philosophical bibble babble.
Okay.
Um, but like images will seep over images. They'll be heavily augmented and edited. Sounds will play in snippets. It is literally. It's just like it's kind of like a Brackage film, but like can like uh spread over like 4 hours or whatever, or 5 hours, however long this is in total. It's just
Okay.
like a meta-textual image collage. But like it's one of those things where I'm actually kind of excited to watch it again because I remember watching it and there was moments where I'm like, I kind of get what he's saying here because there's he references cinema because it's still about the history of cinema. So there's references, they're just very it's almost like surrealism in a way because he's telling the history of cinema through sounds and images that are somewhat connected to each other. So
Hmm.
sometimes there'll be segments where you're like, I think I get what he's saying here because, and I remember this even to this day, and I'm just pulling it up on Letterboxd here. It was December 2022 was when I logged this. So, we're talking about over 3 years ago now since I've seen it.
Hmm.
Um, but I still remember this really cool sequence where there's a clip from a movie that I'm not sure what the clip is, but it's a blonde woman getting attacked by a man. And
Okay.
that scene will be intercut with images of Alfred Hitchcock.
Hmm. Okay.
So I'm sitting there
Like
going,
as
I
not
get
not when you say like shots of actual Hitchcock,
just
the
shots
guy
of,
rather than his
yeah,
movies.
exactly,
Okay.
just shots of Hitchcock. And then interspersed, there'll be a woman getting, attacked by a man. And there'll be no like, narration explaining what you're seeing. But, I was sitting there going, okay, I get what he's saying here. Uh, Hitchcock was an asshole to women. And then the rest of the 4 hours were just like, I don't know what's happening. But for those like
Right.
2 minutes, I was really locked in. You know what I mean? So I feel like I've only scratched the surface. I feel like you could probably get a lot out of this if you really
Hmm.
sat and studied it. Because we can say what we want about Godard in terms of being pretentious and being obnoxious and whatever, but one thing he was not was he wasn't stupid. Um,
No, and
incredibly
rarely dull. I think even
no.
when he was doing stuff that felt more, um, how can we say, kind of like less in his less kind of genre defined works. So even when he was moving in more floaty areas, there was still there was still something that you could hang on to. There was still a degree of structure, even when he was apparently working without structure. So I think, yeah, I'm intrigued too. I don't know if it is. I think it's pretty reasonable for a big box, but like kind of £40 one. So I don't know. I'm on the fence about whether or not to kind of dive in. I think the last Goddard thing that I saw that I flat out loved was Alphaville, and that was a
Mm,
long time ago. But that was so alien to most of his other work that I don't know how good an encapsulation that was of him as a guy, because I think he seemed to be much more interested in other areas more often than he was in kind of trying to dive into kind of any sort of stuff that you would just normally associate with science fiction. Um, but interesting. I think it's one that I suspect will sell bucket loads, though. I think this will do incredibly well for Radiance.
yeah, the Goddard name in itself, but then also the fact that this has just been largely inaccessible for
Hmm.
a long time. I think I when I was originally trying to figure out how to watch this, a few years ago and I wanted to, I did explore options. And I think from what I recall, again, this is a few years worth of knowledge now, but
Hmm.
from what I recall, I think Once Upon a Time Curzon had a DVD of it.
Okay.
Once Upon a Time. Um, Now, whether I'm misremembering or making up a flat out lie, I can't say for sure. But it's been one thing I can say for sure is that it has been largely inaccessible. So this is a world Blu-ray premiere. So I
Yeah.
assume that means a DVD was out at some point. There's obviously a bunch of kind of special features and stuff with this. It includes a couple of his other works, including his last work, which was a short film called Scenario.
Hmm.
Um, I've not seen anything else in this box set. There's a couple of things that I had kind of heard of, like the JLG/JLG. I'd heard of that. The two times 50 years of French cinema. I'd heard of that again just by being a Godard fan and kind of looking at his filmography. There's stuff in here that I've heard of, but I'd never gotten around to watching. Um, so this would be a bit of a dive for me. This would be one that I really kind of deep dive into the extras and stuff like that as well. It does also
Hmm.
include a limited edition booklet featuring some new essays. So those would be interesting to dive in on. Like you said, this will be a big seller, I'd expect. It's a limited edition to 5,000 copies as opposed to their standard 3,000. So I guess
Hmm.
Radiance themselves probably know this is going to be a big seller for them just because of how anticipated this particular release has been. Because it's been speculated on for so long that this is going to
Yeah.
be coming out. So I imagine this is going to sell like hotcakes. And I imagine even a lot of people who are going to buy this are not even necessarily like Godard super fans or anything like that. They'll, it'll be one of those things where it's kind of an event release, where this is like a
Yeah.
big release. It's been unavailable for so long. It's almost has this cult status in itself because of how unavailable it's been. Um, but I look forward to rewatching it and kind of trying to dive into it a little bit more. But I will warn listeners who, if you're not into Godard's late kind of collage anti-cinema, you'll probably fucking hate it. Um, Especially because it's so long. Although I say it's long, it's split into 8 episodes, so you don't need to sit down for 5 hours and watch the whole thing at one go. I certainly
Yeah.
didn't when I watched it. I think I watched it over the course of a week or something like that. Some of the segments are longer than others. Um, from what I recall, it's not even an even split. So I think I might have watched like two in one night and then one another night, stuff like that. So I broke it up over a week. But one thing I will say, like I said, I was utterly transfixed by it. Which is not all that normal for me to get transfixed by stuff like this. Like I think if I remember correctly, when we recorded our last episode, we talked about a film called Viva la Muerte, which is a Spanish surrealist film, and I mentioned it there that I do sometimes struggle with hard surrealism. I find myself tuning out when I don't really understand what's going on. But every now and again, there will be a kind of film that's somewhat surrealist or strange or different that even if I don't know what's going on, it just kind of grips me and I go into this kind of trance state and let it wash over me. And this was certainly one of those experiences when I watched it first. So being able to get to see it in like HD and stuff is going to be even better compared to
Hmm.
the shit quality I watched it on before.
Cool.
Cool. So those are the releases then for July. July, I want to
Hmm.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we'll get into the March stuff now. So just going through the order here. I'm just going to get the some of these out of the way kind of pretty quick because we're mainly here to talk about Miike. So the transmission release that came out in March was a film by Larry Cohen called Special Effects.
Hmm.
You a Larry Cohen guy?
Uh, little bit, not spectacularly so. I've seen most probably know him best for the one that they cited as being his best known stuff, Q the Winged Serpent. I have seen the stuff which I think is his remake of the Blob
Hmm.
or his reinterpretation of the Blob. And I wasn't as impressed with the stuff as I was Q the Winged Serpent. Q the Winged Serpent was pretty good fun, but this one I didn't get a chance to pick up yet. But it sounds intriguing. It sounds like a little bit of a precursor to FX Murder by Illusion in a weird way. When I quite like those films, um, but I think that there'll be a much more like hammy, schlocky version of what I think Larry Cohen will probably do with a little bit more taste and grace. Did you? Is
Yeah,
this one that you picked up?
yeah. So this was actually the first Larry Cohen film that I ever seen.
Mm.
Q the Winged Serpent had been on my watch list for years, but this just obviously came out, so I picked it up and watched it. I enjoyed it. I didn't love it. It's fun if you're okay completely like suspending all belief on how stupid cops can be,
Hmm.
then you'll get on just fine. Because the cops in this film are really fucking stupid. It's basically about a filmmaker who commits a murder on film and then convinces the dead woman's husband to then star in a film about the murder so that he can then recreate everything to pin it on the husband. If that
Hmm.
makes it's so dumb. It's stupid plot. Um, but I appreciate any film that has overt references to Vertigo because this one
Hmm.
has Zoe Lund playing a dual role as the wife and then the new star of the film.
Okay.
So she plays a dual role like that. So any film that references Vertigo in that respect it always gets a positive review from me. It's a fun time if you like. I wouldn't even really call it like a slasher because there's not very many murders in the film apart from the main one that kind of drives the plot. Um, but it's very schlocky. It's quite sleazy.
Hmm.
The The script has some nuggets of really good stuff, and then the majority of it is very hammy. Um, but if you're just into kind of sleazy kind of thrillers, that are absolutely fun. So it's a fun film to watch, regardless of it being or regardless of its stupidity. Um, if you're into that kind of stuff, if you're into that kind of grindhouse, sleazy thrillers, set in New York and stuff like that, then this will be a film that you'll really love.
Hmm.
Um, like I said, I thought it was fine. I had a good time. Whether it's something I'll ever kind of revisit and want to analyze, probably not. But it's a good way to spend, 90 minutes or so.
And
Um,
I always really enjoyed that lead actor as well. I always think he's pretty solid. It's Eric Bogosian, right?
yes, it is. Yeah, Eric Bogosian is the director who commits the murder and is the filmmaker who's kind of wanting to put this all together.
Hmm.
If anything, it's actually a really good look into behind the scenes of filmmaking of like, this kind of level of kind of budget filmmaking. Because, obviously with so much of the film being about them making a film, we kind of get to see a lot of what happens behind the scenes, like how like film was being spliced together and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So it's actually really interesting from that perspective if you wanted to kind of get a look at how budget filmmaking was done in this era in the 70s and stuff. Um, it has a lot of that which is kind of similar to The Stuntman, which was the transmission film that came out a month before, which again was a film about people making films. So it's interesting that we got two of those kind of back to back from transmission, like films about filmmakers and about the process of making a film. Um, but yeah, like I said, this is good. Wasn't anything like amazing. Like pretty much everything that's in this film was done better in Blowout, for example. This kind
Hmm.
of idea of something being captured and then reused in a film and having to figure out, if what was in the film was real and stuff like that. I think Blowout does it all like way better,
Hmm.
especially with the Hitchcock references and stuff as well. But like I said, this is a good time if you're into Larry Cohen, if you're into kind of 70s low budget Gonzo Street filmmaking, if you're into sleazy thriller films, it'll be right up your alley. I know there's a massive market for this stuff, so there's a reason why it
Hmm.
was put out. Um, so I'm sure this will sell well, even though it wasn't like one of the big fancy limited edition thick boxes. So it's not on 4K. I'm sure this will sell pretty well. And the special features were actually really good. There's a really good interview with Christina Newland about Zoe Lund's life and career,
Okay.
which was interesting because she was an interesting person in terms of her career path and the kind of stuff that she went through in her personal life with like addiction and stuff like that. She was really interesting. So Christina Newland does a good job of kind of breaking down her career and her life. So the special features on here are pretty good as well. So
And there's a huge interview with the director as well. I think there's it's over an hour. I think it's like 71 minutes. I'm just checking the special features of Cohen
yeah,
and Cohen.
it's an archival interview done, which is yeah, basically Larry Cohen kind of just discussing his career
Yeah.
essentially. It's kind of a career retrospective. So it was done in 2017. It wasn't newly done by Radiance, but so I assume it was done for some other release at some point in time back in the day.
Mhm.
But there is some newly recorded stuff. There's a newly recorded interview with Eric Bogosian and a new audio commentary done as well. So, um, it's not all archival. There is some new stuff on there too. Um,
Oh,
so that was the transmission release in terms of mainline Radiant stuff. One of the kind of standard release, the one that was just on a Blu-ray, was a Polish film called The Dancing Hawk. My Polish is awful. I think the way you pronounce the director's name is Grzegorz No, can't do it. Sorry. I don't
I'll
want
give
to
it a try.
insult. Yeah, you give it a go.
Krolikovic?
Krolikovic. Yeah.
Yeah, Krolikovic, I think.
Yeah.
But my Polish is probably equally bad.
Yeah, it's one that I really struggle with because just some of the letters, the way they pronounce kind of letter combinations are just so different to everywhere else in Europe. So it's one of the languages I've really struggled with when I kind of read something and then I hear it and I'm like, that does not match what I'm reading. So I've always struggled to pick it up from there. This film was really interesting. So look, the story didn't do much for me. It's basically your kind of standard um, kind of rise from lowly beginnings up the bureaucratic ladder in kind of communist Poland. So the story is nothing too crazy. But what really the way that that I would kind of sell or recommend this film is that it is one of the most visually interesting films I've ever seen in my whole life. Um, Stylistically, I would kind of say it's like a Terrence Malick film meets an Andrei Zulawski film.
Okay.
Just in terms of how it's shot. The cinematography was done by a guy whose name I also cannot pronounce, so I'm
Yeah,
not
I'm not
even
gonna
going
try
to
that one
try.
either. That
Yeah, nah, not for me. But the just the ideas that he has for how to shoot stuff is just it's completely unique to him. He was just tying cameras to stuff and just saying, fuck it, hit play and we'll see what happens. We'll see how it comes out. So some of the angles that you get, the way the camera moves, like he literally was just like attaching the camera to like a tree as it's being shaken or
hmm
to the back of a trailer and it's kind of showing up from like a really weird angle. Or you'll have characters who are like talking to each other, but the camera is focused on the back of someone's ear, and they've obviously shot a light directly at the person's ear from the front, but out of view of the camera, so their ear is just like lit up red.
Hmm.
And but like there's just like a normal conversation going on. Like every scene, every shot even is is just not normal. It's not conventional.
Okay.
Everything it is like every time a new scene starts, you have no idea how it's going to finish in terms of where the camera is going to go, how it's going to move, the way the characters are going to be positioned, the way like the mise en scène is going to be composed. It's the most unpredictable films visually, which makes it kind of funny because, like I said, the plot is not all that interesting. It's very loose as well.
hmm
Again, I would liken it to like a Malick or a Zulawski, where the plot's kind of secondary. It doesn't have a real kind of beginning, middle, and end, and it doesn't even really have scenes per se. Things just kind of merge together, and we kind of just move from a collection of shots to another collection of shots, and it's kind of up to you, the viewer, to piece it all together. Um, so that would be off-putting to some people for sure, that it doesn't really have a conventional narrative.
hmm
Um, but if you're anyway interested in very visual storytelling, and if you're interested in cinematography, just even like from an amateur point of view, or even if you are like, thinking about getting into filmmaking and wanting to understand that there are no limits on how you shoot a scene, there are no real rules on how to shoot a scene, and this is a great film to watch, just just to understand that there, like I said, that there are no rules, that you can approach a scene any way you really want to. It's just about how confident you are that you can pull it off is the main thing.
Hmm. Okay. Intriguing.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where you know, it's definitely won't be for everyone, like I said, story wise, but if you're interested in visuals, might be worth picking up. Because like I said, I'm not gonna lie and say that I thought the narrative blew me away and that it's a story I'm gonna remember for the rest of my life, blah blah. That's not the case, I'm not gonna lie, but I will remember the visuals for a long time
Yeah.
because just some of the scenes, the way they're composed, it's just like nothing I'd ever seen before, or nothing that I'd ever consider, in a way of
That
shooting
sells it to me
film.
more than I kind of only gave it a passing glance, but hearing what you've said actually piques my interest a lot more than it had previously. So thank you. I think because I do love those kind of situations. Like like those films that just unashamedly try and just do their own thing visually. And it looks like there's also two short films by the cinematographer on the disc as well. So I think it's potentially kind of be interesting to kind of see what his his other work is like too, and see if that's something that the cinematographer's kind of brought to the table rather than it being necessarily driven by the director's sensibilities.
Yeah, the cinematographer is mainly known for a film called Angst that I haven't
Mm.
seen, but I know that a lot of people love. It's this kind of horror film. I've never seen it now, but I believe at some point it was on the Criterion channel, and a lot of people were raving about it, about how like visually engaging it is. So I
Okay.
think it might be more to do with the cinematographer just having this really unique approach to filmmaking. But I would need to watch more of both of their films. Now, I have seen the other film that Radiance put out by this filmmaker, which is called Through and Through. That was
Hmm.
also very visually stimulating, but it didn't have like the strongest plot. I'm just gonna double check really quick if it was the same cinematographer for both. Um,
While you're checking that, I'll speak a little bit about the cover art because I think that this slightly going against what I had said earlier. I think this isn't a straight photographic element. These are actually two illustrations, but I think kind of one they're kind of original Polish illustrations, and I do get the sense that they've been curated slightly in how they've been used. So I don't know for definite, but I suspect that it is Time Tomorrow doing the overall putting together of the package, but they just in this instance kind of used illustrations by two Polish artists.
Yeah, it was those Polish movie art is kind of its own distinct thing.
It really was, yeah. I don't know if you've
Um,
seen many like Polish posters for American movies
yeah,
in that
exactly.
era.
They just,
Oh
you know,
wow.
they really had so much creativity there. But I,
Yeah.
like you say, I assume this was somewhat done by, someone in Radiance because, it wouldn't have the dancing hawk in English on the
Yeah.
Polish poster. It would have obviously been done in Polish. I've just checked there, so Through and Through was by a different cinematographer.
Cinematographer. Okay.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, the cinematographer of this film does not have an extensive filmography. Um, Mainly just like shorts and TV stuff. So I feel like I need to watch more of both to try and figure out who who's bringing maybe they're just like a perfect combo. Maybe they just found like each other's filmic soulmates or something.
Mm-hmm. Quite
Um,
possibly.
but yeah, like you said, I'm interested to who drove that creative vision now that you say it. Because like I said, it's like nothing I'd ever really seen before. The last kind of
Cool.
standalone release, this is a 4K, but it's a standalone release, is the film by Ivan Passer called Cutter's Way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One thing I didn't realize till like way too late until like after I'd watched Cutter's Way is that I actually know who Ivan Passer was because he did a really good. He's actually a Czech filmmaker.
Okay.
Because I remember like I initially glanced over and I thought Ivan Passer, nah, don't think I know him. And then I was like midway through the film, I'm like, wait, Ivan Passer, the Czech guy? And I went and looked it up, and yeah, it's the Czech guy. Because he made a really brilliant film during the kind of Czech new wave called Intimate Lighting that I really like.
Okay.
And then he was also the co-writer on a few of Milos Forman's films before he moved to America as well, obviously.
Hmm.
But on like Loves of a Blonde and The Fireman's Ball, which are probably Milos Forman's most well-known non-American films. Um,
Okay.
he was the co-writer on this as well. So now, from that perspective, Cutter's Way is an entirely different type of movie to those. Those are kind of more coming of age social dramas. Cutter's Way is very much a neo noir, but it's very interesting in that in how character driven it is. So it sets itself up as a kind of a murder mystery thriller. So you have a character played by Jeff Bridges, who is this kind of laid back, chill dude, educated, you know, sexy guy. He just gets around town and stuff, and he happens across a girl getting murdered. Um, but because his car was in the area, well, no, sorry, he happens across someone fleeing a murder, but he doesn't realize a murder has happened. It's not until the
Okay.
cops come and say, your car was at the scene of the crime, where were you, blah, 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 that it kind of opens up, hey, well, I saw the killer, he looked like this, we got to go figure out who it was. And you think it's going to be a standard kind of murder mystery. He gets
Uh-huh.
involved with his friend Cutter, who's played by John Hurd. Um, and they kind of play like a yin and yang of like post-Vietnam America, because you have Jeff Bridges' character who didn't go to Vietnam because he went to college, so he avoided the draft. Like I said, he's cool, he's suave, he has money, he's a chill guy. And then you have Cutter, who was in Vietnam, ended up losing limbs, he lost an eye, he's heavily damaged, he's very paranoid. And he's the one kind of driving this idea of this being this big conspiracy behind the murder.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
and it's just about those characters bouncing off each other more so than anything else, really. It's almost like a precursor to what I like to call like stoner noir,
Mm-hmm.
where there's like a mystery, but like what the characters are doing is a bit like it's a bit more laid back. They're not really actually too like the film itself is not too stressed about solving the mystery.
Mm-hmm.
It will leave you some
It's
pieces, but
more
it's
interested
more
in who's solving it rather than what it is they're solving.
for sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, like there's a few films like that, like Night Moves would be another one as well from this kind of era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with Gene Hackman.
Yeah, exactly. Just
Yeah.
has a kind of similar vibe to Night Moves, where like yeah, there's like a thing, there's a plot here, but we're just gonna hang out with the characters more so. Um, than worry too much about the plot. So if you're into that kind of like laid back neo noir that's really heavily character driven, then Cutter's Way would be, would definitely be a film for you. Like I went in with kind of weird expectations because I actually mixed up this film with another film in my head.
Okay.
In my head, I thought I was going to be watching Rolling Thunder.
Ah, uh-huh. Okay.
Because the reason why is because a few months ago I finished reading Tarantino's book Cinema Speculation, and there's
Mm-hmm.
a chapter where he talks about post-Vietnam films, and he mentions both of these films, but in my brain I got the plots mixed up. So
Okay.
I was waiting for stuff that Tarantino mentions in the book to happen. I'm like, none of this is happening. Where have I gone wrong here? And then I figured out that I was just watching the wrong movie. Um, but once I figured that part out, I really enjoyed this. I'm a big fan of kind of character study films. Like I'm not really too fussed if there's not like an answer to every mystery in a film. I like ambiguity. And this film, to be fair, it does leave enough pieces there where it's up to your own interpretation on whether this was a big kind of conspiracy murder, or whether, it was just a random thing and it's all just, in the head of Cutter, the paranoid Vietnam vet. There's enough evidence to kind of you, the viewer, can decide which you prefer. Is there a world where there's these elite, class of elite people murdering young girls, which, in the year 2026 is very prescient?
Seems very likely. Yeah.
Um,
Uh-huh.
or is this just a crazy coot who's gone off his rocker, and is, like Charlie in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where he's like putting stuff together on a board
Mm-hmm.
that are not really connected. And the film lets you decide which of those it is. Um, there's enough evidence there. There's that ambiguity, which I really enjoy. I like when a film trusts me to make a decision
Mm-hmm.
about what I want to have happened. So this is definitely one of those films. So this was a 4K release, as I said. It was limited to 5,000 copies. Interestingly enough, this is not the first time that Radiance have sold Cutter's Way, because originally Radiance were partnered with, I want to say it was Fun City Editions, who are a Region A label, and
Okay.
they distributed their version of Cutter's Way in Region B via Radiance. Um,
Mm.
that partnership ended years ago now at this stage. So I found it funny that this then came out, but obviously in a 4K rather than a standard Blu-ray. And I must say the artwork for this release is phenomenal.
Yeah, it's
Just really,
beautiful.
really beautiful. And it has that nice thick hard case that Radiance are known for as well, not those flimsy little thin cardboard digipacks that certain companies beginning with C put out. That annoy me. So this is a really great release. It's probably my second favorite release of this slate. We're going to talk about
Okay.
my favorite one shortly. This is probably my second favorite of all the films that kind of came out this in March. So really, really great film. If you're into neo noir, that's a bit more laid back. That's not kind of like it's kind of like the antithesis of something like The French Connection or something where it's like guns a blazing. It's very chill, very laid back, very much character study. If you're into that, then you'll really dig Cutter's Way. It's a great kind of a vibe film.
Cool.
Right. Well, I suppose we'll get on to the feature presentation. So the definitely the biggest release of this slate is a box set by a dude called Takashi Miike.
Hmm.
It is Miike, right? It's not Mike.
Yeah.
I know it's not Mike.
No.
I
No.
got
No.
told that years ago. His name's not
No.
Mike.
Yeah. Hit
Uh,
the double eyes. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So Takashi Miike, so this is a trio of films that he put out in the late 90s, early 2000s era.
Yeah.
Called it's been packaged together as a as Underworld Chronicles, three Yakuza fables,
Mhm.
with stunning artwork. The blue and the purple of this, it just stands out on my shelf so beautifully.
Yeah.
Um, Artwork on the set and on the individual releases are just phenomenal. So big round of applause to Better Tomorrow for for what they did here. There is a fun Easter egg on the underside of the box set. Did you see that, Dragon?
Yes, I did.
Oh, good. I'm
Which
not
is
going to
kind of
spoil it for the listeners, but there's a if you have the box set and haven't looked underneath the box set, have a look. I didn't notice it until I was like rearranging some stuff on my shelf, and I was like, "Wait, what the fuck is this?"
that's yeah, that line's kind of pretty much inextricably linked into it. I should say we won't spoil, but I will say it's a line of dialogue from one of the three movies, and
Mhm.
it's kind of quite synonymously linked to that movie. I think if I just say not to say the movie, it's a line from Agitator, and there was a recently a release of the movie in Australia from Umbrella, and they
Mhm.
did this. They pulled the same line, so I think they put it on the back of the box. Radiance put it on the underside, but yeah, I think it's a great moment in the movie, and it's kind of not hard to see why people zero in on it.
Yeah, and see, I saw that before I'd watched any of the films, so
Okay,
I was like, what the I was
huh?
like, why the fuck is is Miike telling him saying fuck you for? At the like from little I kind of know about Takashi Miike, I was like, oh, this kind of fits by the sounds of things from what I've heard about this dude. He's saying fuck
A
you for
little
watching my
bit, but
movies.
no, he's much. I think he's much maligned. I think kind of. I'm very glad that Tom Mes is heavily involved in this set. So Tom Mes
Mm,
has worked. I think all of the new interviews that have been done by Tom Mes. Who's for anybody who likes Japanese cinema, Tom Mes's name has just been around forever. He's had an incredible website back in the very early days of the internet. Because I think called Midnight's Eye, where he wrote about Japanese cinema. He's been a massive supporter of Takashi Miike in particular, and so I think has interviewed him over 7 times and has written 2 books. The original one was called Agitator, and then I think his update was called possibly Reagitator or Reagitated, when he basically kind of expanded it to include more of Miike's work since his original book came out.
mm.
But I think his big thing is trying to get people to not always use the words extreme or unhinged in relation to Takashi Miike because there's a lot more to him than just that. But I think and for a lot of the movies of his that came to the West first weren't necessarily his first movies, but they were ones that were easy for people to sell up or speak about the kind of extreme sides of things. But we'll get into that as we dive into these three a bit more. Should we say the titles? So we're getting Fido, the New Generation, we're getting Dead Outlaw Record, and we're getting Agitator.
Hmm. And I think what you're kind of pointing out to say that there's a lot more under the guise of being kind of an extremist filmmaker or a filmmaker that dabbles in the extreme. I think that
Mm-hmm.
this box set does a great job of showcasing that because I mentioned this to you before, like when we were setting up the, that we were going to be recording this, that I'd only seen one Miike film, and then that ended up being a lie. I'd actually seen two. I'd seen Rainy Dog, and
Hmm.
I'd seen his remake of Graveyards of Honor. Both of them were
Yeah.
many years ago for a different podcast. I didn't really remember them, but obviously most people who, like me, had never dived into Miike know the reputation of the extreme films.
Yeah.
And
Addition and Ichi the Killer in particular, the two
yeah,
that I think which
absolutely.
were made around this exact same period as the three movies that are on the Radiance set, but are well, maybe there's a kinship of sorts to Fudo, to Ichi the Killer, in that they're both kind of adaptations of anime, and that's something that he would revisit multiple times through over the course of his career. He's quite often looked to anime books as inspiration, but sometimes he'll take, as is the case in Fudo, he'll take the stories further than it had the chance to go in the original books. So I think with Fudo, the series got cancelled before in his mind before it got to the good stuff. So I think it was his mind to try and complete the story or dive back into it and actually explore where the story was naturally headed. In the case of Fudo, but yeah, he's a fascinating, and very hard to pin down filmmaker. He's kind of very um, I wouldn't say unpredictable is maybe the wrong word, because I think there's still
No, but there
incoherence
is a
to
little
much
bit of
everything he does.
everything. Like if you
Yeah.
pull up his filmography, which I've done a few times over the years just to have a look, it's extensive and but also very varied. Um,
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
certainly
Massively
more than
eclectic.
what you would expect on face value of like, you think about, like, at least again for me, just speaking from a very general point of view, most people would say um, violent films, kind of films with extreme stuff in them, both from a violence and a sexual point of view. That's what most people would know Miike for who haven't explored his filmography. And now, obviously, I'm doing a little bit of digging here now myself because I like to do that when I explore a new filmmaker. I like to know a little bit more about the context of their career and what they, common themes and stuff like that. And what I'm learning with
Hmm.
Miike is that there's a lot more under all of that.
Hmm.
He has a lot going on in his films and in his filmography. I suppose before we go talking about the individual films themselves, can you bring any kind of context around this whole V cinema stuff?
Yeah, sure. I, I think the kind of the whole V cinema movement essentially started with the birth and explosion of home cinema in Japan, where I think the video rental stores were becoming a thing, and so the idea of making low budget movies specifically designed to basically what we would think of as straight to video, it's essentially
Hmm.
the same thing, but a large amount of Japanese directors kind of cut their teeth on B cinema, and they were given an unbelievable amount of license in terms of they weren't really scrutinized or held to the same sort of degree of studio control that some of the movies that were going into theatrical releases would have had in the 1960s and 70s in Japan, partly because the industry had changed and it downsized massively. So the companies behind an awful lot of the V cinema titles were the same companies that we were familiar with as being the giants of Japanese cinema in the 60s and 70s. So it was Toei and Toho. They were basically putting lower budgets into the idea of making films. Although they're called V cinema, a lot of the time they're shot on film. So they're
Mm.
not, it's not V cinema to denote sort of shot on video type of
Yeah.
cinema, though some of them occasionally were. But there was a huge amount of them shot, and most of in fact, I think all of the ones that we're going to talk about today were all shot on film stock, though usually it was Super 16 to kind of keep the costs down a little bit. But generally, they were given an awful lot more of a free rein to kind of just do whatever they wanted to do. So I think that there's a great jumping in point if you for those that are maybe on the fence about this, but I've been picking up other releases from other people. That there's Arrow put out a kind of essential V cinema box set, I think just last year,
Oh, okay.
that was a really great mix of I think I can't remember exactly how many movies are on that set. I think it's maybe 8. I think I can't remember. Anyway, there's a bunch of movies on that set that are all wildly different, and kind of really gives you an idea of how diverse and broad V cinema was in Japan, kind of through the 90s and into the noughties. And some of the directors that came out of that movement only ever really existed in that world. But much as we saw with Spielberg in the States, where he'd made Jewel to be a straight to TV movie, but then the studio had such confidence in it that they released it theatrically. Same story here with a couple of the titles on the box set, where they ended up basically originally being conceived of and shot for V Cinema, but then ended up getting a theatrical release, which was quite a big deal, I think, at that point for the V Cinema directors. Their stuff was normally just expected to kind of be played to people at home, but the studio and the kind of the funders felt that, I think even just upon seeing the rushes, felt that there was enough there to warrant them, getting a theatrical release. And Miike certainly saw his career explode, not just domestically in Japan, but through a couple of film festivals. And this is all covered beautifully in the book. The book's a really great collection of articles, from some of them from the time when the movies came out. And there's a really nice one by Tony Raines. And then there's an interview with Miike himself, I think, from Tom Mez's own archives. And then there's a couple of newly kind of missioned pieces of writing as well that all kind of place kind of Miike's work in context really, really well. It's one of my favorite booklets that's come out so far, actually, in one of the Radiance box sets. It's just a really great mix of articles. They're all really fascinating. And I always love hearing Tony Raines speak, but you kind of forget that Tony Raines is an equally adept and skilled writer, and kind of did a lot more of that before he kind of started being more well known for doing kind of video extras and commentary tracks in more recent years. But his writing's always really engaging and really interesting, and he certainly gets to the crux of kind of Miike's appeal, but is very realistic and pragmatic about it, where he's saying not every one of these is going to be a masterpiece, but they're all inherently really interesting, and in amongst them there are absolutely some masterpieces. But he's a really fascinating filmmaker. I think he, in a weird way, it takes us back a little bit to what we were speaking about with the Polish movie release from March, where there's a sense that he doesn't really put much stock in the general accepted conventions for how to necessarily go about shooting a scene, and he'll find his own way of navigating that story. And sometimes it will kind of be in kind of montage set to music. He rarely will kind of go with the idea of shooting a wide and then doing a close-up. But sometimes certain sequences are just played out in kind of a couple of shots that you wouldn't necessarily expect. But it keeps his stuff really unpredictable and really vibrant and really alive. I think he became a little bit more traditional in more recent years in terms of how he was putting together some of the stories that he was telling. But I think a big part of that was because he was revisiting movies that had been incredibly successful in Japan decades previously. So he remade 13 Assassins and he remade Harakiri, which are both kind of considered absolute classics. And remarkably, although there's a strong argument to be made that neither of those movies needed a remake, but they're amazingly respectful adaptations where you can clearly see the reverence that he had for the original films. And in those moments, he does kind of knuckle down and is a lot more of what we would think of as being a kind of conventional filmmaker in terms of how he's staging his shots and how he's kind of putting together the sequences of the movies. Maybe more so slightly in 13 Assassins than in Harakiri. I think 13 Assassins remake works a bit better than Harakiri's remake, but then that's a much tougher sell because Harakiri is just an absolute masterpiece of a movie.
It's one of the best films ever made, hands down. It's like so it's always going to be a tough. It's like if someone remade, Citizen Kane or Vert. Like I regard Harakiri up there,
100%. Yes, legitimately it's a masterpiece, and he's I think also continued to work a lot on manga adaptations, even going up into more recent kind of years, and Fudo the New Generations, the manga adaptation that we'll get to that's in this set. But he did Blade of the Immortal, which I think is actually almost as enjoyable, if not maybe slightly more enjoyable than the animated series that's kind of based on those same series of books. And Arrow had put that out years ago, I think probably under Fran's remit. So I kind of get the sense that Takashi Miike's been in Fran's world for a long time. I'm sure he was instrumental in bringing Edition out, because that's had releases. I think it was released initially by Tartan over here, but then it subsequently had releases by Arrow in multiple formats.
Yeah, I would have to guess it was Tartan, because Tartan were known for that kind of Tartan Extreme range in the early 2000s, wasn't it, on DVD? I think like Old Boy and stuff would have all been originally released by them, so I assume Audition would have been the same.
Definitely. But Audition are very different movies to the ones that we get here. There's certainly a kind of a unifying kind of loose umbrella of them all being movies about the Yakuza, but they're wildly different films. And
Completely
shall we go
agree.
through them
Yeah.
in order of when they actually came out chronologically? So the first one up would be 96, which is Fudo the New Generation. And that is the one that's the most comic book like in its sensibilities. It's maybe in some ways the wildest in terms of some of the stuff that's in. There's a few clips of it that have ended up becoming memes that have been shared in the millions without people necessarily knowing where they come from, which is one of our two female kind of, I don't know if it's so clear to just call them assassins. I guess they're kind of the support network of our main lead in this, because essentially, I mean, without giving people the full story, but we're really kind of following this young school kid who's found himself as being a boss of a subset of a Yakuza, because he's basically been born into it. His father is a much more senior member of the Yakuza, and his elder brother was, this is not a big spoiler for the movie, was sacrificed pretty unceremoniously by his father to basically get his father out of trouble with his own Yakuza bosses. So his elder brother was decapitated when he was very, very young. And then we have a massive jump cut in time through to when he's at school and is kind of basically starting his push to try and ultimately get revenge or to fight back against the people who had ordered for his elder brother to have to be sacrificed on the altar of the Yakuza's very strict code. And so he then goes about kind of assassinating the kind of various other gang bosses that had been instrumental in that decision in a variety of pretty grisly and quite entertaining ways, because he has some wild members of his own little group, ranging from incredibly young kids, when there's like sort of 7 or 8 year old little young boy hitmen that are fantastic, and then two schoolgirls that he's attending school with. One who's generally kind of guns are a weapon of choice. The other girl, who's we find out might not be entirely a girl, is capable of firing darts from what can I say that's a acceptable podcast way of putting it. She's in an almost Thai entertainment show type way. She's able to kind of blow darts from her lower extremities, and does
we
so
can
with
be
lethal
explicit
effect.
here. There's
Oh, great.
no.
Well, then yeah, she's able to kind of blast darts from her pussy. And the one little shot that went viral was there's a point when she attempts to kind of try and shoot this big behemoth of a guy who's ended up joining the school with a dart, but is on her period at the same time. So it ends up kind of basically shooting a streak of blood at this guy as well, which he takes entirely in his stride. But that one singular moment is maybe the one that people would maybe think of as being the most Miike-esque element of this movie. But it's actually kind of pretty restrained in terms of the storytelling. It's quite a good, understandable linear structure, and it's shot really well. And I think all the performances are really good. There's some kind of pretty great character actors in here. There's a bunch of Miike regulars will show up, but I kind of find it's not my favorite film on the set, but I think it's probably pretty close. It's maybe my second favorite film of the three that are presented here. How did you get on with it?
Yeah. So this I watched them in order of what was on the set. Actually, no, that's a lie. I watched this one first anyway. Because it was the first one there. And watching it, I'm like, obviously I'm going in with my preconceived notions of what a Takashi Miike film and is like. And I'm like, yeah, this is hitting all those expectations that I had for what it's one of the most wild film watching experiences I've had in a lot. It's like, I think you may have undersold. This film is fucking bananas. This is an insane film. Um, that scene of, those scenes in particular where this character is shooting deadly darts out of her vagina is it's just one of the most batshit concepts I've seen on film in a long time. Did not expect it. Did not like when that first happens in that, that kind of club or whatever. I was thinking, what the fuck am I watching? Uh, in an entirely good way, in a positive way. Um, I agree from a storytelling point of view. I think it's really strong. It's really solid. Out of the three, this was probably the easiest to follow, I think, narratively. It's the meat and potatoes of the plot is very straightforward, kind of classic Yakuza film of revenge against a boss who
Hmm.
did wrong. I don't think there's anything too difficult to follow, even for someone like me who openly and admittedly does struggle with Yakuza films sometimes, just in terms of the complexity and not really knowing enough about the cultural side of things to kind of understand the ins and outs, which we'll kind of talk a little bit more on with the other films, especially Agitator.
Hmm.
Um, but I think it's a very straightforward film to follow. I actually think it's a great introductory film to the box set, even though it's so stylistically different to the other two films in the box
Hmm.
set for the large part, because it's just fun. It's a fun way to spend. I don't know how long this film is, what, like 90
Pretty
minutes,
short.
something like
Yeah, it's
that.
like an hour and a half. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great way to spend that. It's super bloody. The action is really well done. Obviously, there's some utterly batshit insane scenes, and like I would argue the one like where she's shooting the dart out of her vagina, even the one where she's on her period, which was like, what the fuck? But even those, like, I don't even think those are the wildest scenes that include that character. There's a
No,
much
no.
crazier scene with that character later on in the film.
Hmm.
A few, in fact. Um, so this is, yeah, it's one of those films where, for me, I had no idea where this plot was going. From the offset, once things started getting crazy and it was kicked up, I'm like, fuck it. I'm just sitting back. I'm just gonna take what's happening as it comes. I'm gonna enjoy myself. I'm having a fun time. The score slaps. It looks great. The colors are really, really great. Some of the composition is really beautiful. Like there's the scenes where Ricky is standing like buck ass naked holding a sword, and it's like a really beautiful, well lit scene. It's like just like really nicely composed. Like the dude is just like buck ass naked flinging a sword around, so it's kind of weird in its own way. But
Hmm.
it's like really well done, really well, like the lighting especially really well lit. Um, so like I think this is a great opening to the box set. This was my favorite of the set, in terms of like enjoyment factor, I guess. I think there's another one on here that I think is probably on paper the better film.
Okay.
Um, but from a purely just like film enjoyment, entertainment standpoint, this was my favorite. Like if I was to only rewatch one of the three again, I'd rewatch this one.
Okay.
If I was
Yeah,
only
that's
allowed to
understandable.
rewatch one of them, it'd be this one just because it's fun
Yeah.
and it's
And
bananas and it's a little bit unhinged.
this is the one when I mentioned earlier that originally shot to be a home cinema, a home release on VHS, but then ended up getting a theatrical run. This was the one that I was kind of thinking of, because it absolutely started not intending to kind of be released theatrically, but was released theatrically. And I think it also was one of the ones that first started being sent in the late 90s to other film festivals. So it was kind of quite instrumental, although we think of here in the UK and in America, I think to a degree, we still think of Audition as being the one that kind of really broke him out. But I think this was one that traveled very well internationally as well. And was actually made a couple of years before. So Audition was 99 and Fudo was, like we said, was 96. But yeah,
96,
it's a,
yeah. So
yeah.
in terms of like Miike's career path, was this his first theatrical film then? Like was he only shooting V cinema until this point?
I think no, he did a kind of trilogy of movies that Arrow had previously put out, kind of the Shinjuku Triad
Oh,
Society,
yes, I
and
do know
then
that box
Raining
set,
Dog, the
yeah.
one that you've seen from. And I think they might have originally be conceived of to go straight to video, but then kind of broke out as well.
Okay.
But I think he started not quite, maybe about 5 years previous before Fudo, his directing career had kind of begun. So he'd probably already done, got a dozen movies or so by the time that he made Fudo.
Hmm.
And most of those all went straight to kind of videos. So this is kind of certainly probably one of the first big kind of breakouts, and certainly the one that broke out internationally first,
Hmm.
more so than the other ones. But I think on the strength of his storytelling, I don't think that the Fudo um, manga books, which were cancelled before the story kind of got to where we see the movie going. I don't think they were that well known internationally. I don't think that they'd kind of sold particularly well outside of Japan, and presumably weren't even selling well enough locally for them to decide to kind of keep going with the books,
Right.
because it was cancelled midway through its run. But I think it's by this point he was already pretty capable in terms of his kind of filmmaking technique and kind of what he was doing and how he was constructing the projects that he was working on. He was already kind of knew what he was up to and knew what he wanted and knew how to achieve it. So it's a pretty good example of him at this period in terms of being really capable. But when you do get around to watching Audition's a wildly different movie, and it's has moments of intensity, but they're very different. They're a lot less comic booky. It's a lot more psychological horror going on in Audition. I don't think there's really any horror going on in Fudo. It's just kind of a straight out revenge plot with occasional moments of gore, but it's pretty, compared to some of his other stuff, I think it, and certainly if you compare this to a lot of people go into Miike first through Ichi the Killer, and that kind of prepares you in a way that an awful lot of his other movies don't necessarily ever get to some of the extremities that Ichi the Killer does. So I think the Extreme Tag was very much born out of Ichi the Killer, because that's the one that's probably the most insane for me anyway, from the ones that I've seen, because I certainly haven't seen every single film that he has made, and most of the ones that I've seen all came after these three movies. So it's really nice to kind of be able to kind of get some more experience to see some of his kind of late 90s stuff, because he was kind of really prolific at this point, often making 3 or 4 movies a year, which is not uncommon for people who are fans of Hong Kong cinema. So I think back in the heydays of Shaw Brothers and Golden Harvest, when they were at their peak, it was very common for filmmakers and actors to be working on kind of 4, 5, 6, sometimes even as high as 8 projects in a single year, which is wild. But when we think of it in terms of kind of compared to kind of Western production cycles, but he was pretty prolific. So I think 96, he had a quiet year when he made Fudo. He just made the 1 movie. The year later he would do 2. The year after he would do 5. So I think he was getting more and more prolific at this stage, and I think an awful lot of that came out of the success of how well Fudo did.
Very cool. So if we want to move on to Agitator, that's obviously the next film in this set, which is wildly different stylistically. There's 2 cuts included. I watched the standard kind of 150-minute one, as opposed to the 200. I was going to actually watch I was just going to take the leap and say, fuck it, I'm going to watch the 200-minute version. Until it said that like a lot of the materials, it was just like salvaged, I guess, rather than all being
pretty SD. And also, I don't think it needs to be that long. I don't know if at some point it originally be conceived of to be put out as a serial,
right?
Maybe even as a TV serial, rather than, because it feels to me a lot like a bunch of episodes of something that feels more like a TV series than it does a movie. There's a lot of where, again, we're going in circles slightly, but again, a lot of this movie is much more concerned with the lives that these characters are living. So it's in no real race to get to the end of the story that it's telling. Things happen at a very different kind of pace, and I think I think the sort of standard 130 minute version is probably the best one to watch from my point of view, not just from the quality loss when you're watching the other one in SD, but I just also think the story works better over that sort of length of time. I think it outstays its welcome a little bit in the longer cut. I'm glad it's on there, but I think for me, I probably wouldn't, beyond the interest factor of seeing it once, which I have done, because the longer version's also on the Umbrella release, which I had previously, but then sold when I knew that the Radiance set was coming. I've seen the longer version, and it doesn't add a huge amount more to the story that changes it dramatically. It's just essentially gives you a lot more character beats of the characters basically doing things that aren't necessarily driving the story forward in that moment. You're just seeing them existing and seeing what the kind of, sometimes the banalities of Yakuza life can sometimes be like, particularly for the lower level guys. But yeah, Agitator, incredible cast. Not the strongest cast of the 3 that we'll get to Deadly Outlaw on time, but a phenomenal cast in Agitator with some kind of really really incredible performers and people that are almost worthy of having a podcast episode dedicated to them, who are often just used fleetingly here. I mean, there's a couple of guys in this movie that don't really show up until the third act, but who are incredible to kind of see. We'll kind of get to one of them. I think I'll get to him when we get to Deadly Outlaw Record, because he's in that too, and he adorns the cover. So we'll save him for Deadly Outlaw. But yeah, a pretty wonderful cast here, led by someone that we've previously seen in a Radiance release. So the main, I guess, the chess playing grandmaster boss, so the boss of all bosses, in Agitator, the one that is kind of really essentially, his character's called Kaito, but it's Hiroki Matsukata, who is the main actor in The Rapacious Jailbreaker.
Mm-hmm.
He's a little bit older here, and phenomenal voice for this type of role. He's got a real gravitas to his Yakuza boss, but he's the one who's ultimately kind of tasked with initially trying to mediate between a dispute, but then as you get more into the movie, you realize that a lot of this has kind of been orchestrated to shift the balance of power, and ultimately he's trying to consume the smaller, lower level kind of Yakuza gangs into his gang, and that is being pushed forward by some of the guys in those smaller gangs and pushed against by some of the even lower down guys in those other gangs. And as the story kind of unfolds, but basically it becomes more and more bloody and more vengeful, depending on who is involved at the time. There's kind of some individual little kind of wee revenge plots that are sort of separate to the main storyline that just happen between a hitman and kind of our main, I guess you'd call him our leading man in this, Kanzaki, Masaya Kato, who's one of the more photogenic of the Yakuza actors that were working in this sort of period. He's a very, very handsome man, and lets us know it, because I don't think we see him wear a shirt buttoned up or a top buttoned up at any point throughout the entire movie, even when everybody else is. He's just got a pretty wild costume design. I don't think that a leather tracksuit and Adidas Superstars was ever like a de rigueur outfit choice for Yakuzas, but apparently it is here in a Takashi Miike movie, and he somehow manages to pull it off. So everyone else is in the suits that you would expect, and he's wandering around in a leather tracksuit, completely unbuttoned down to the waist, and a pair of Adidas sneakers, and looking pretty great. And he's kind of the character who ultimately we end up, although he's not the main driving force of the first third of the movie, he's ultimately the one that you kind of come to realize that this is largely his story, really, as we get through the second act and through to the last act. And he's really watchable. He's really entertaining and really charismatic, powerful without being obnoxious or overbearing, but he's pretty cool.
Yeah,
How did you find him?
He's one of these unassuming leads in a way where you're drawn to him as the lead. Like as soon as he, like you said, it's not like we're following him from the offset from like the very first second in like you would in a kind of traditional kind of action film where we have our star and we follow him for the whole duration. Mm-hmm. He becomes a player naturally as the narrative progresses, and then he becomes our kind of main character that way. What's really cool. Sorry, go ahead.
But I was just going to say, there's a small little kaleidoscopic way in that's kind of almost feels like its own little separate short film that's voiceovered by his girlfriend, explaining the time when they first met. And you kind of initially wonder if she's going to be the narrator for the whole movie, which she's absolutely not. There's just this nice little kind of wee section of how they met. And their relationship comes back as little touchstones. Really, anytime that he picks up this little camera pendant that he's got, that when you look through, you see a kaleidoscope. And so periodically he'll look through that and remember her. But that's really very disconnected to the rest of the story. Like you kind of start wondering with dread if she's going to get pulled in and used as a leverage point against him or something. But then thankfully that never happens. It's just that kind of exists as the fact that he's one of the few Yakuza members who has a relationship that we see outside of the gang.
Yeah, it grounds him emotionally.
Yeah, we see it a little bit with his elder, his direct elder, or his kind of main boss that he thinks of himself working for, who are a smaller group that's already been incorporated into a larger group, but are still this slightly unpredictable, little kind of more unrestrained in terms of more likely to just go off and do their own thing and damn the consequences groups and the rest of the Yakuza around them. And certainly we see his elder brother or his boss. We do see him at home briefly and understand that he too has a life outside of the gangs. but it's very fleeting. There's a little bit more of that in the extended cut, but not to any kind of great advantage.
Yeah, it's interesting that way it showcases those kind of like sub factions within, like, you know, you would expect maybe if you haven't seen a lot of Yakuza films where you don't know too much about how it all works, but you'd expect it to be a kind of a cohesive kind of structural organization where
Mm.
orders come down from a big boss and then everyone carries them out. But this kind of showcases that idea of squads and factions existing within larger organizations,
Hmm.
that they do have some level of autonomy, but then also need to answer for actions occasionally, depending on what they are. Um,
Yeah.
I know that you haven't seen them yet, but the film that I would most closely connect this to stylistically is actually the Godfather, the Japanese Godfather trilogy.
Hmm.
They're very similar in terms of they are meticulous and it's kind of, I don't want to say slow because that has negative connotations, but they're deliberately paced, feature a lot of subplots, kind of densely layered, and also just happen to have Hiroki Matsukata in them
Hmm.
because he plays a pretty significant role in the first one. Um, so I was actually really intrigued watching this. This was the one I watched last
Okay.
out of the box set, just because I think when I was going through it, there was like one day where I had more spare time than the other, so that's why I watched Rekka first, and then this one. I don't remember if there was a logical reason why I watched it last. Um, but I watched this one last, and it was I this is the one that I mentioned earlier where I think on paper this is probably the best film out of the
Hmm.
three, at least in my opinion. We'll kind of talk about Rekka shortly. I think on paper this is the best one, just in terms of how densely layered it is. But it's one of those things where every action has a reaction. There's not scenes that are in here for the sake of it. Um, you know, subplots and characters come back around again in ways that you might not expect later on down the line. Um, which is very similar to how the Japanese Godfather trilogy is paced out. You'll watch, a film, you'll watch like the first film and there'll be a subplot and you're like, how is this relevant to what's going on to the main plot?
Hmm.
And then eventually it will make sense to why it's there. So in a way, I found this kind of similar. Like for example, the way the hitman comes back around kind of at the end of the film. For
Hmm.
example, um, you know, there's there's not a lot of one and done scenes in this. Everything has a kind of a knock-on effect or a domino falling that has an effect over the course of the film or might come back later in a kind of a ripple. Um, so I think even though it's not my favorite from an entertainment point of view, I think it's probably the best from looking at it from like a critical eye. I think
Hmm.
it's probably the best film in the set. Like I said, the cast is very great across the board. It's obviously a very deep cast considering the story it's telling, which again very similar to the Japanese Godfather trilogy. With the cast list, and that is pretty insane across the trilogy in terms of just all these great character actors of that era of Japanese cinema. It seems like again you'd know a lot more about this era of Japanese cinema than I would, but it seems like Agitator is the same where it just
Yeah.
features a lot of great actors from this era just showing up in different roles.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of my main pull from this is to tell you to get on the Japanese Godfather trilogy.
Yeah. Me
Um,
too.
because if you enjoyed the style of Agitator in terms of in terms of how the story is told, then Japanese Godfather trilogy definitely up your alley.
I'm sure I'll enjoy them even more because the Japanese Godfather came quite a bit earlier than this. They're
Oh yeah,
late 70s,
late
and
70s. Yeah, yeah.
that era of kind of Yakuza movie I absolutely adore. So they'll be a no brainer for me. I kind of have in some ways held off watching them because I know that I'll absolutely love them. I just kind of want to have the time and space to be able to kind of binge them. So
Mm.
I kind of want to just kind of go all through them all and probably in a single sitting and just revel and enjoy it. But Agitator for me was probably my I think you're right, and it's the best movie on the set. But I think for me, it's also probably my favorite of the three. Though Fudo is a very close second, but I really really enjoy it. I think It's the one that has the slightly more, although there's quite a lot of similarities in the story between this and Deadly Outlaw Recca. I think that I prefer having this kind of extra space and time to spend a little bit more time with the characters than we do in Recca, which is a much shorter movie. So for me, I think I'd probably say that Agitator is the one that I enjoy the most out of the three movies that are on the set. But it's one that I know that because of its runtime is one that I probably won't revisit as often as I maybe might dive back into Fudo.
Yeah,
Or
for
Recca,
sure.
actually.
That's exactly it for me to a degree as well. Sometimes like, you do have to commit to a 2 hour plus film that has
Yeah.
quite serious themes, whereas you're like, fuck it, let's go watch vagina shooting darts. Let
Yes.
us throw on food. Oh, fuck it. So there is definitely that is just that degree of it. One thing I will say about Agitator, and this is coming from me again, who's coming into this fairly blind to Miike. I think Agitator is a great example of a film where Miike just shows how great of a filmmaker he is just making a normal film. Now, like obviously, um, there's still some. Actually, now that I think about it, I think I'm. Is this the one? This isn't the one where the microphone goes up the asshole, is it? Or is that Rekka?
Yes, yes, yes. No, this is
This is the
that.
one where the microphone goes. Yeah. So that's weird.
Yep.
That's obviously weird. So it
A
still
little
has
bit. Yeah.
it still has the weirdness there, but like that's like 1% of the film, and the other
Yeah.
99% is just really great filmmaking. And not to say the microphone of the asshole isn't quote unquote great filmmaking, but I just mean from a classical sense. Um, so if you're someone who was maybe like me, who was maybe not necessarily put off by Miike, but you know, was interested in watching something that wasn't going to make you squeamish, then
Hmm.
like I think Agitator is a perfect film for that because it's just a great film. It's
And we should also
simple
say
as
that
that.
the person putting the microphone up the asshole is Miike
Is
himself.
Miike
So
himself,
he's
yes.
yeah, in a little cameo. He kind of plays the slightly kind of out of control gang member that starts the chain of events happening, really, because he ends up getting killed as a result of how much he's kicking off. Because they're basically kicking off in a part of the town that's not technically under their own gang's control. So
Correct, yeah.
they've gone into a kind of a different area and are causing trouble. So I think he ends up he's only really in that kind of one scene, but it's his death that ends up sparking a whole bunch of repercussions, and that kind of spirals off into the movie. And as far as Miike goes, although it's a pretty grisly scene, it's relatively well restrained. There's a pretty nasty assault on one of the young girl assassins in Fudo
Hmm.
that's nastier in terms of it's kind of more viscerally on screen. And the one instance that we, or the one other instance that we get of some guy kind of beating up a girl is kind of dealt with in plot, where kind of one of our main yakuza ends up taking out the guy who's assaulting his girlfriend as just a kind of bit of background action that you kind of see outside this kind of bar or this cafe where they're kind of meeting, and he kind of goes out and just kicks the guy in the face and knocks him out cold because he's slapping around his girlfriend outside when they arrive. But so there's a lot more restraint in this than we see in either of the other two movies,
Hmm.
in terms of some of the action that's on screen. And he does some really interesting things cinematography wise, like just after the assassination of one of the big bosses, when um, we see kind of the shaved head guy, who's the direct boss of our main character. We kind of see him speaking to them and trying to tell them to bide their time, and then getting into a car, and he drives, and he doesn't like the interior of the car at all. He just lets the neon light from outside occasionally shine his face, and it's a real big emotional beat for that character in that moment. He's kind of screaming with frustration at the fact that this has just happened, and he just lets that play out in almost complete darkness, so you don't see his eyes illuminated at all. And it's a really kind of beautiful little sequence.
Hmm.
And there's a bunch of those little moments through this where he's kind of taken the time to allow these kind of little moments of kind of visual experimentation in amongst something that's for the most part pretty grounded in how he's kind of staged it and how he shot it.
Hmm. For sure. Yeah, like I said, like to really really kind of batter down the point from a filmmaking point of view, this is fantastic. So
Yeah.
like this and this is kind of changed. Well, I don't want to say it's changed my outlook per se because I was always very much open to the idea of watching more Takashi Miike films. Um, but this really kind of opened my eyes to his skill as a as a more classically inclined filmmaker, and it's definitely made me more interested in going a bit deeper um, into the stuff like, like 13 Assassins and even like
hmm
Harakiri and, stuff that maybe would be more classically inclined than his more kind of crazy films.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, like I said, Agitator is probably the best film on paper in the set, which I suppose will
yeah, I would
lead us
agree.
to, which is apparently both of our least favorite films, just by the power of deduction, of Deadly Outlaw Rekka, um, which was this was the last film, yeah, that came out. So this was in 2002.
hmm
Um, what can you tell us about Deadly Outlaw Rekka?
This has, although it's not my favorite of the three movies, it's incredibly enjoyable. I think the story is a little bit more shambolic in places,
Hmm.
but it has the most incredible cast assembled out of all the three films that we've seen.
Okay.
We get a little kind of small cameo from Sunichi Chiba. It's Sonny Chiba, though it's not really a Sonny Chiba movie. But we also have, I don't know if you spotted the kind of elder, the most kind of senior member of the Yakuza. The character I think is called Sanada, but that's Tetsuro Tanba, and I don't know how familiar you are with him, but if you remember back to the old James Bond movie, You Only Live Twice, there's a character called Tiger Tanaka that James Bond meets when he gets to Japan, who's kind of his guide through, and ultimately ends up supplying him with men, and they drink sake together.
Right.
That's the same actor. That's Tetsuro Tanba, who was a pretty huge deal himself back in the 60s. He's in a wonderful movie called Samurai Spy, which got a Criterion release before, and he's in the Bahachi Bushido movies, or one of the two Bahachi Bushido movies that are kind of well regarded as being kind of real post Lone Wolf and Cub kind of exploitation slasher, fountains of blood style movies.
Hmm.
So he was a kind of really kind of great action and dramatic actor back in the day, and here he kind of very still stoic character as the kind of elder statesman, and then a lot of the guys who are surrounding the various gangs here are pretty wonderful too. There's a guy who also is pretty central in Agitator. We didn't mention we're covering Agitator, but the actor's name's Kenichi Endo. But anybody who is a fan of Gareth Evans' second Raid movie, he's the kind of the head of the Japanese gang that comes in when there's negotiations between the Indonesians and the Japanese in the Raid 2. And Kenichi Endo in Agitator is the one who's kidnapped by the lower level gang guys and tortured for information. So yeah, his kind of scene when he gets kind of handed back is kind of quite instrumental. So he appears here in a slightly larger part in Deadly Outlaw Rekka. And then we also have to speak, because we didn't speak about him in Agitator, the wonderful Yoshiyuki Yamaguchi, who is the guy who graces the cover if you're looking at the box set for Underworld's Chronicles, and it's a head being strangled by two decapitated decapitated arms, because he's the hitman who appears at the beginning to take out this aging gang member who just won't go down without a fight and ends up kind of losing his arms in the attack, which when he gets back to report, he still has these hands attached around his neck. But that actor's incredible. I think he shows up towards the last act of Agitator, and he's still going strong. He is with another actor of a similar sort of age. They're in a series of movies called The Unification of Japan, which are because they're still making V cinema movies in Japan. They're a kind of series of made straight for video Yakuza movies, ultra low budget. That is, I think, just about to release its 70th feature length entry.
Jesus.
So they've been going for a while. They're mostly, like I say, ultra low budget. But Yoshiyuki Yamaguchi is a central part of that, and they spun the series off into the one standalone kind of action movie last year called Isolated, which I'm hoping that a Western company will pick up, because it's a phenomenal, incredible little kind of really tense, taut little action movie that is largely a one-man show for Yoshiyuki Yamaguchi. He's also, I think, does an awful lot of motion capture for some of the those kind of Yakuza games. And I think he's a kind of motion captured in those quite a bit, and does the animated series motion capture as well. And was in Tokyo Vice, for anybody who watched the Tokyo Vice TV series that was on HBO a couple of years ago. But huge amount of on-screen presence. He's a really pretty intense guy, and particularly in this era when he was really athletic. So he's the one that I think he pulls off a butt shot in two of these three movies. I think we kind of see him wandering about naked. Certainly do in Agitator, and I think we do briefly here when Rekka goes to pick him up and he comes out. So sorry, it's not Rekka who goes to pick him up. It's kind of one of the other hitmen characters comes to pick him up, and he goes outside without remembering to put on any clothes. And they have this conversation walking down the street, and they get kind of halfway down the street before the other guy realizes, like, wait a minute, you're completely naked, and doesn't even say anything about it. But you see this sort of look and understand that the guy's wondering what's going on with him. But he's got a bigger part to play, I'd say, in Deadly Outlaw Rekka. But yeah, a really kind of more wild and a little bit more loosely contained movie when compared to Agitator. It's a little bit kind of more rough and ready, but still really, really good fun. And one of the few that has the extended use of a bazooka in its last reel as well, which we don't often see as a method of taking out your rivals, and just turning up with a bazooka. And one really memorable shot when one guy literally gets hit by the bazooka and then carried off into the building that he's firing at. And it's kind of one of the more kind of unhinged visual moments in this movie. But yeah, how did you find it? How did you find Deadly Outlaw Rekka?
It's funny that you brought up the bazooka, because every time I kind of read anything about this film leading up to watching it, everyone was just talking about the bazooka, and I felt like maybe my expectations were in the wrong place, because that wrote a check that the rest of the film couldn't cash.
Yeah, a little bit.
In a way, I know I watched this one out of sequence, I guess, technically speaking, but in a way, I'm kind of glad I watched this one second, because the opening, with the opening kind of kill and how insane it is, and the hands ending up around the throat, and then the kind of final sequence, with the said bazooka, are so weird and out there that they're in the same kind of cinematic universe as Fudo, but then the entire middle of the film is much closer to Agitator,
Yeah, 100%.
stylistically. So I feel like this was almost a kind of an interesting gateway film between those two, between Fudo and Agitator. And I feel like watching like the this would probably come off worse than what I mean it, but like in a way, this film set me up well for Agitator. So I'm like, because I don't think I would have enjoyed Agitator maybe as much, or I might have been more thrown off by Agitator if I didn't have this in between as almost like a weird halfway house palate cleanser between Fudo. Now, saying that, I didn't actually really enjoy the middle section, of this. I found it a little bit tedious, and a little bit sloppy, a little bit all over the place. I found the way, because obviously it's a shorter film, it's again about an hour and a half, but they try and fit a shit ton of plot into that hour and a half. For me, it was kind of like, this sounds, again, I don't want to sound too harsh on this because it's not a bad film, but it's almost like just like a worse done version of a Fukusaku Yakuza film. Because obviously a lot of his films are, again, very similar run times. They pack a lot in, but they're obviously very well done because that's just his style. He knows how to do it. Whereas I felt like this was just kind of a bit more of a sloppier version with less interesting characters. But then, again, the start and the end are cool, so you kind of forgive it to a degree. But it's one of those where, like, I would dread having to watch this again anytime soon. I would happily come back to it in a couple of years to give it another try. But if you told me, Adam, tomorrow you got to sit down and watch Outlaw Rekka, I'll be like, okay, I guess so. Just because of the middle part was just a bit of a slog to get through, and the whole way I was just waiting for the bazooka. To be honest, I was just sitting there going, "Where's the bazooka? I want to see the bazooka because this is kind of boring. Show me the bazooka." So, in a way, I kind of regret even reading about the bazooka, because I was just waiting for that to happen the whole way through. So maybe I'd actually enjoy it more now that I understand the context, or now that I have, know what to expect for the whole film, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think for me, it's the weakest of the three movies too. And I think largely just because the other two films do a better job of telling the story that they're trying to tell. I think I like the fact that it's got such an incredible cast, but I don't think it ever really manages to use them quite as well as I maybe would have hoped. But it's hard when doing these sort of things when you have such a large ensemble cast, kind of giving everyone their time. And I think it's just for me, it's one of his movies that works a little bit less than others. But I have friends that will put this higher than both the other two movies that we're speaking about, and
Well, that's the
it's weird
funny
that just
thing, yeah, because I have a similar experience. People that I know who are more into Miike will talk really highly of this film. So that's why I was kind
Mhm.
of surprised that I didn't really enjoy it as much.
Yeah. No, I think that there's better examples of his filmmaking out there, but I'm really glad that it's included here, and some of the extras that they put together for it are really good and kind of made up for the fact that it's one that I probably won't revisit as often as I do the others. And I think I'd like to go through this with Thomas's commentary, because I'm sure he'll tell me an awful lot of stuff that I didn't necessarily catch on the. I think
Yeah.
it's my third watch of Deadly Outlaw Rick. It's one of the ones I'd seen a couple of times before the box set came out, and I hadn't seen it for a little while. And I think I enjoyed it more. It looks a lot better than it did when I saw it previously. Because the last time I saw it was on a DVD. So the kind of the new restoration that's been done looks beautiful, and the movie, even though it was shot, I think there's another one that was shot in Super 16. So there's it's not the kind of highest resolution movie that you're ever going to see, and I think again pretty low budget, but really one that I'm glad that they included. But I think, and it makes sense to include, given that there's a sort of overriding theme that it fits well into. But
Mhm.
yeah, for me, it was probably the weakest of the three. But I'm certainly not saying that it's a weak movie. Just not as good as the other two.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Like I said, I definitely wouldn't call it a bad film. And I'm sure there's a lot of people who would be super into that middle part of the plot. But
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, that's just not me, and that is what it is. But I'm sure we know it's not even. I don't even have to be sure about it. I know there are people that really dig this film because I've walked among them, and they've
Mm-hmm.
told me that they really dig this film. So it's definitely there's an audience for it out there. Um, and then obviously we didn't really do too much of a deep dive into the special features, but obviously there's a shit ton of them.
Yeah.
As mentioned, there's newly commissioned stuff by Miike, himself included, new interviews, introductions. There's audio commentary from Tom Mess, another audio commentary with Miike, which was an archival one.
Mm-hmm.
There's a documentary, which is an archival one. There's multiple archival interviews, both with Miike and Shusuke Tanahara. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously there's the 80-page book that you mentioned as well that features new writing and archival writing as well. So
Mm-hmm.
I think in terms of the value you're getting for your money is pretty good, just speaking from a consumer point of view, because obviously you're not just getting three films here, you're getting a ton of supplementary material to kind of help you understand the context of what you're watching as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which at the end of the day, that's why we get into boutique collecting for the most part. It's not just about watching the movie, it's about getting that context that special features and supplements provide. For a lot of people anyway. That's why we get into this business. And then other of us are just sickos who need to collect something to feel joy in life. So there's also that as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Well, look, Dragon, it's been great having you. I've stolen a lot of your time, and I'm very conscious that it's getting late on this Friday night.
It's okay.
So I very much appreciate you dropping by to discuss these films. Um, I have a funny feeling this won't be the last time we're going to have you on the podcast. We'll talk about it a bit afterwards when I stop recording. That'll be a secret for the listeners out there.
Mm-hmm.
But again, appreciate you having on. To all the listeners,
My
I'll be
pleasure.
back again probably around sometime next month. I don't have another Vault episode planned for this month. So I'll see you again for the next announcements, and we'll go from there.
Thank you for listening. To hear more shows from the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network, please select the link in the description.
Greetings, welcome to Two in the Pinku Podcast. Experience a deep dive into softcore Japanese sexploitation cinema from the 60s up into the present, with an emphasis on sleaze and seduction. We are monthly or bi-weekly, and we're not even bi.
Will pink film save our marriage? Find out on Two in the Pinku Podcast.
Hey, this is Jason Kleberg from the Force 5 Podcast, a show that forces a guest to come up with a movie-themed top 5 list topic, and then we reveal our picks on air. Top 5 heist films, top 5 tearjerkers, top 5 movie dogs. Every show you'll be asking yourself, what would be on my list? Guests include directors, screenwriters, actors, podcasters, musicians, authors, and even a professional wrestler. Subscribe to the Force 5 Podcast, and you won't just be a listener, you'll be a list nerd. The Force 5 Podcast, available wherever you're listening now.
Hello and welcome to Tumbleweeds and TV Cowboys. My name is Hunter. In this podcast, I'll be joined by a different guest each week to discuss a classic Western movie or TV show. I've been a fan of classic Westerns for as long as I can remember, and in recent years, they've become very nostalgic for me. I love the aesthetic, the tropes, and I love seeing different filmmakers' takes on them. At their best, they're incredibly entertaining, rewatchable, and some of my all-time favorite movies are Westerns. We'll mostly focus on Western movies made in Hollywood, but we'll also be covering spaghetti Westerns, and one thing I'm very excited to get into are Western TV shows. I've got some amazing guests coming on the show, film professors, historians, and podcasters, and Tumbleweeds and TV Cowboys is part of the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network, and many guests on the show will be from other shows on the network. Thanks for listening.
Have you ever wanted to dive deeper into the horror movies you love? Beyond the Blood is a horror podcast for fans who want more than just surface-level screams. We do deep dives into the movies that shaped us, digging into director commentaries, behind-the-scenes stories, deleted scenes, and the special features that most people skip. Each episode is a love letter to the genre. We break down how these films were made, the creative risks that paid off or didn't, and the lasting impact they've had on the genre as a whole. From 70s slashers to modern nightmares, we celebrate the craft, chaos, and characters that keep us coming back. If you're the kind of fan who rewatches movies with the commentary on, or you simply grew up in the video store horror aisle, the Beyond the Blood podcast was made for you. New episodes every single week. Subscribe, and let's dig deep. Welcome to the Beyond the Blood podcast.
Whoa! Okay. I'm ready. Welcome to Split Your Head, a bi-weekly podcast hosted by me, Bob, that covers the gamut of all things horror, exploitation, cult, underground, experimental, transgressive, bizarre, and indie. I've been fortunate enough to connect with some of the most groundbreaking and upcoming filmmakers, writers, and artists. Don't expect a typical interview. I love shooting the shit with my guests and stumbling on surprising topics that'll literally split our heads. From splatter comedies to nihilistic sleaze, uncomfortable art house to genre classics. If it gets my brain buzzing and cracking wide open like a watermelon full of blood, then I would like to share it with your ears. Now a part of the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network. Hi, Mom.